Okay, SE8 on page 165. We're going to use the information in the adjusted trial balance from SE7. To prepare the closing entries for Samira Corporation. So, okay, so we're going to use the we're going to use the adjusted trial balance information from Samira Corporation from December 31st to do the closing entries. So, on our problem for SE7, we had first, what's the first, if you remember, we had 4 closing entries. There's always 4 closing entries. First, you're going to close what? Close sales? And then what? Okay, so we're going to close sales to our income summary. Second, we're going to close all of our expenses to the income summary. Then we're going to close our income summary. Good. Income summary to our retained earnings. And then fourth, just like we had before, we close the drawing, but we don't have drawing, we have dividend. So we're going to close our dividends to what? Retained earnings. Okay? So those are the 4 steps in our closing entries. So we're doing this as of December 31st. The first one is going to be, for this company, it's going to be service revenue. How much was our service revenue? How much was our service revenue? $1,300. So we're going to close our service revenue, and we're going to debit it. Why are we debiting it?
Because it's offset.
Good, right. And we're going to close it to our income summary. So we debit it to close out the balance to 0, because the normalized balance for revenue is a credit. So to close it, we debit it. Then we have also on December 31st, and that line is the explanation line. I'm not gonna use the explanation line. December 31st. Now I'm going to close my expenses to my income summary. So I'm going to debit my income summary, and I'm going to credit each expense. And what are the expenses that we have here?
Wages expense.
We have wages expense,
Rent expense.
wages expense, rent expense. What else?
Income taxes expense.
Income taxes expense.
Utilities expense. Finally.
Utilities expense. So you guys, if you haven't done this already, you should be doing this on Applia, okay?
Telephone expense.
And then lastly is telephone expense. So you guys doing this? Because it's due at 12:30.
I'm doing it.
Okay. 12:30, yes, as in half an hour. So income summary. So what's the total of our expenses? Okay, working on it. So wages expense is how much? $450. Rent expense, $200. Income tax expense, $475. $175. Utilities, $100. Telephone, $25. So that totals up to $950. Okay, so my debit to income summary is for $950. Again, that's the explanation line. What's my next thing to close?
Income summary.
Right, I'm going to close my income summary. So, what's the balance of my income summary right at this point in time? 1,300
2,000.
minus 950. So it's 1,300 minus 950 is
Not, she can get all.
350. So the balance, is it a credit balance or a debit balance? It's a credit balance. How do I know that?
It's on the right side.
Right. Well, right. Because right now my revenues were greater than my expenses, right? Okay. So if my income summary has a credit balance, I've got to debit it to close it out. So I'm going to debit my income summary. And what am I crediting?
Retained earnings.
Retained earnings. For how much?
350.
350. Not doing the explanation. And then December 31st, the last one, it said in the problem that we had dividends of 175. So am I going to debit my retained earnings or credit it? Debit it, because it's a reduction to me retained earnings. So I'm going to debit my retained earnings, which has a normal side balance of a credit. I'm going to debit it for 175 to show my retained earnings going down because of that dividend. Is dividend an expense? No, it acts like an expense, but it's not an expense. It's not part of the normal operations of the business. Do businesses have to give dividends?
No.
No. Do they have to pay their expenses?
Yes.
Yes, right. So it depends on whether the business wants to give the dividend or not. So that's the whole problem right there in a nutshell. Those are all 4 of your closing entries. Boom. Right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Good? All righty.